Good morning, everyone. As Marlena said, I'm Craig Theriac, Vice President of Product Management. I have the honor to be up here today to talk to you about security and SE platform, which I know is the very first thing you want to start your day off with after a fun night last night. Thank you to the marketing team for such a cool event. Before I start, I often get to go to events with CIOs and directors of IT where I'm able to ask questions such as, how many of you have witnessed firsthand a security breach, either yourself or a colleague, or oftentimes if I'm an MSP-specific event, I'll ask about clients. And what used to be people would raise their hands maybe 5, 10, 15% of the time. I personally am seeing the trend closer to 30, sometimes beyond that in the market. This really is prevalent, and hopefully if you've been in that room with me where I've asked that question, you didn't have to raise your hand, but not everybody's so lucky. I think oftentimes, if you are in an incident like this, there is a financial impact, and every year Verizon puts out this data breach investigations report where they kind of quantify the impact of a breach. They also dig into the details of what caused it, locations, all sorts of interesting information in there. But on average, the cost per incident is just under $4.5 million. And that's up about 15% over the last 3 years. And if you're like me when you first read this, you think, but that doesn't necessarily apply to me. And so I always try to dig the next layer down to understand, how much would it actually impact me if I were in this situation? And for organizations that had 1,000 employees or less, that number was actually closer to $3.3 million. So still very impactful to the business. And it's disruptive at the time that it happens. It's expensive. But let's not forget the personal aspect of this. There's an IT administrator sitting out there that has to deal with the impact of something like this. The other thing I'll point out as part of the data related to the imperative of security and why we care about it is that it's especially important to note as part of this, 82% of the people that cited an incident as part of this report were related to public cloud and private cloud usage, right? So that's where we play in the HCI space. So very important for us here today. Navigating the complex landscape of regulatory compliance really is crucial for organizations that are trying to protect against security breaches. There's a diverse array of standards, and I think many of you are very familiar with these. In fact, I've had many conversations this week with people in healthcare and people in retail where you have industry-focused compliance concerns. It really depends on the industry. It depends on the type of data that you're processing and that you're storing, really the geographic location in which you're in. And let me first say that when I'm talking about this, I recognize that these security bodies and frameworks and things go way, way beyond just the infrastructure that we provide here at Scale Computing. Kind of think of it as a set of policies that you have to adhere to, and it's the strict adherence to those policies is where these frameworks come in, and even being able to audit to make sure that you have done that, to tell the world that you have strictly adhered to these policies. So with that, what we're going to talk about here today is how SE Platform aligns with the requirements, both through its design principles as well as a lot of the feature set that we have built into the product to be able to operate in a regulated environment. Before I actually get into those design principles and the feature set, though, let's talk specifically about ransomware. This is one of the fastest growing segments of cyber threats out there. And I see it in our own customer base, as you can see through some of the quotes on screen here of people that have been infected with ransomware and how they've dealt with it. And luckily for our customers, there are some easy peasy ways that they can recover from these types of situations, as quoted from that first line there. But in this type of attack where they're encrypting the data, in fact, there was a survey that went out just this last year, and they do it every year. Sophos puts this on. They surveyed 3,000 IT professionals across the world, so it was really all over. And the response was, and this is just astounding, 66% of the respondents of these 3,000 IT professionals had been infected with ransomware in the last 12 months. Almost 2/3. And again, digging a layer down because I'm me, it's like, how much does that actually apply? It was 62% where organizations with employees of 1,000 or less. So really, really high. And we are seeing that in our own customer base. We're trying to really make sure that the comprehensive feature set and the design that we have built into this product, we're trying to transform what could be an absolute disaster into really manageable incidents for our customers. The framework of what we're going to talk about here today, you're going to see this fall into 3 different pillars, I'll call them. SE Platform is secure by design, it is secure through simplicity, and it is secure by default. And if you're, again, like me, as you first thought through this, you thought, it was all kind of the same thing. They are not mutually exclusive. The topics we're going to talk through kind of bleed from one to the other. When you create a product that is secure by default with a really secure design of the software functionality, you end up with a product that is simple to use. So you'll see that theme throughout here. But let's start with secure by design. And I think many of you probably recognize this graphic that we have on screen. We have it in all sorts of literature, from our decks to just pieces of collateral as we talk through the simplicity of our model. Usually when we're showing this off, we're comparing against a 3-2-1 model, right? Where you've got a handful of host servers running either VMware or Hyper-V, connected down into shared storage, SAN or a NAS, and you might have a separate management server off to the side as well. And usually we're trying to highlight the operational simplicity. It's how easy it is to deploy, how easy is it to manage. And what we're talking about here is how easy it is to secure. Also, you'll see us compare this against an HCI model, VSA. With a VSA, you are virtualizing those same storage protocols that I just talked about in the 3-2-1 environment. And both of those are susceptible to network-based attacks, man-in-the-middle type of attacks, that just doesn't exist in the paradigm of HyperCore, SE Platform, SE Fleet Manager. One other piece that I think is really worth talking about here as it relates to alternatives in the market is when you're looking at disaggregated solutions like the 3-2-1 and the VSA, you're often talking about not just differences in the various layers of software, you're talking about different vendors that represent every one of those layers. So when there's a vulnerability that exists in one of those layers, and you go to update just that layer, you have concerns about the compatibility of that update against everything else in that stack. HyperCore is fundamentally different than that. We own the entire stack, from the hypervisor on down. And so when there's an update, when there's a vulnerability that we find or our community finds, and we are addressing that with a patch in one of the components within our software stack, it's released with the full stack. And we're testing everything from the critical BIOS all the way up to make sure that as an atomic unit, we're not regressing in functionality. The result is that our customers are more likely to apply those updates, and if they're more likely to apply them, they're going to be protected against the latest, rather than some kind of concern about applying one area, maybe I need to test it first. It's speed to address the vulnerabilities in the market that's important here. The secure nature of SE Platform extends beyond HyperCore into Fleet Manager, and there are all sorts of things that I could talk about here related to pen testing and other things that we do within the Fleet Manager product. But I think one real principle that I think is worth talking about that exemplifies a lot of what we do is the outbound architecture that we have for communications between Fleet Manager and HyperCore. By default, when a node comes online, we talked yesterday about zero-touch provisioning, and I'll talk later about Secure Link. But when we are communicating, we communicate from HyperCore up through the firewall to Fleet Manager and not the other way around. And that's very intentional. We're adhering to best practices in the industry to do that. And the reason is, if you open gates for things to communicate down into your network, you're almost inviting exploits by bad actors. So we're adhering to best practices. We're making sure that that communication is outbound over secure ports 443 to make sure that that is encrypted and that is intact from a security standpoint for that communication outbound. But we're also maintaining security in the network by not inviting our customers to make decisions that we don't want them to have to make. Let's move on now through to secure through simplicity. And in this section, I'm actually going to walk through a handful of features related to security, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means. We're going to talk about them each individually. The thread that ties all of these together really is simplicity, and I think as I was thinking through security and preparation for this presentation, one of the things that really struck me is that every feature we design around security, honestly every feature in general, it has to be intuitive enough to be used. If it's not intuitive, nobody's going to use it. And with security, not only does it have to be intuitive to use, it has to be intuitive enough to not misconfigure it that might lead to some exploit or some vulnerability being exploited out there in your environment. In addition to that, it has to be visible. You have to be able to maintain this over time. So again, that's the thread for these next few as we talk through them. We'll start with role-based access control. The idea of being able to restrict functions by user based on their role. And on the HyperCore side, so we'll start with the Fleet Manager side. On the Fleet Manager side, that's things like being able to only list out the number of clusters and the clusters that you have in your management to see what is out there. versus being able to go in and add and delete clusters from the organization. Under HyperCore, that's things like, I think view only is actually a really good example of this. I talked to a number of you that have junior sysadmins in your environment, and you only want to be able to give them visibility into the environment, but you don't want them to actually be able to shut off a VM or turn or delete a VM or anything that could impact operations of the business. Similarly, many of you know that we have integrations with third-party products to provide backup functionality within the product. This is a really good use case for being able to use role-based access control using the backup role, right? So you set up Acronis, you set up your backup product, you assign it this user role of backup and make sure that they can only do the backup functionality and nothing beyond that. So restricting the surface area of what the things that they're able to accomplish. And we tie that all in with audit logging. So every security-related or other function that happens within the system is audit logged to the HyperCore cluster log. And that is accessible in the UI, of course, but it's also accessible via syslog. And we also have API access to that to be able to integrate with SIM tools. If you need visibility for monitoring and reporting and analysis of this data, you have it accessible to you. Now, we pair role-based access control with our single sign-on functionality. On the HyperCore side, we use OpenID Connect on Fleet Manager. It's Google's Firebase, and we use both of these to be able to integrate with third-party IDPs or identity providers. The way this functions is just a protocol. If you've used it before, it redirects you to whatever that third-party provider is. You authenticate the user there based on whatever role you've assigned them, receive a token back and a redirect back to our product that allows you to log in with whatever role or ability you have as that user to access functionality within either HyperCore or Fleet Manager. A lot of these third-party IDPs also have more advanced authentication options in there. So things like multi-factor authentication or integrations with other third-party products like Duo for multi-factor authentication, those become possible to just add another layer of security on the authentication process. What I love about this feature for our users is that it actually exemplifies this entire point on this pillar, which is secure through simplicity. It allows a really seamless experience to go from Fleet Manager to HyperCore and back while maintaining the high level of security you need in your environment. Right, so HyperCore utilizes or comes with the capability of being able to spin up UEFI VMs. With UEFI VMs, you have the ability to use Secure Boot. When activated, Secure Boot effectively validates the cryptographic. That was one I'll probably need a little more coffee to be able to say. So we'll try this again later today. Cryptographic signatures of the boot process and the operating system, all the other boot level software to make sure that there isn't any malware, there's no compromised software in that process. If there is anything detected in that process, the VM will not boot. It's going to protect you against those types of malware infection. Additionally, we also have features such as virtual TPM. And those of you familiar with TPM, in the physical world, it's a trusted platform module used for encryption keys and other sensitive information to be able to store on there. We make use of that as a virtual TPM to make it accessible to virtual machines running in your environment. This is most commonly used with third-party products to be able to encrypt data within the guest. So tools like Microsoft's BitLocker, which is really common in our user community to see used, as well as Lux in the Linux world, allows you to have that in-guest security and encryption to protect against any unauthorized access of sensitive data. Well, let's talk about immutable snapshots. This is actually a topic that came up in Mitch Etchison's session yesterday, and I think there may have been some follow-on questions related to that, and I'll try to cover that here as part of the security topic. Immutable snapshots really are the cornerstone of our HyperCore data protection suite. It allows you to instantly take a snapshot, you keep as many as you want, whether it's a manual snapshot that you're taking at one point in time or part of a policy that allows you to store snapshots locally and have a retention schedule associated with that, or we use that as the basis for replication to either backup or offsite for DR to have a really comprehensive plan around backup, retention, business continuity related to your workload staying up and running. When I say this is immutable, what I mean is when you take a snapshot, that snapshot is unalterable. you are unable to go in and actually make a change to that snapshot. There is no way to make a change to that snapshot. When you are recovering, like those ransomware examples that we gave up earlier, those people were recovering from prior snapshots that they had on the system. To recover, you clone a snapshot, and you spin up that workload, and it is a separate instantiated VM that you can interact with, but it does not change that original snapshot. And similarly, when you go to a snapshot and you clone a virtual disk from that snapshot, you're mounting that clone, not the snapshot, but the clone of the snapshot to another running VM to do things like file level recovery. The snapshot itself does not change. And one of the questions that I think came up in the last session was, right, but can't you delete it? Well, that's where role-based access comes in. When you have role-based access control, you can set the roles to make sure that the permissions exist for only those users that should be able to delete snapshots. And those two combined give a pretty good coverage to immutability in the environment. Managing security across various hardware devices and systems, it really is daunting for users, especially if you're in a 3-2-1 environment or using other kind of pieced together disaggregated solutions. In scale computing, we take that challenge and transform it into a really straightforward process for our users. First of all, with every release that goes through the release cycle of scale computing, we will automatically scan for vulnerabilities. If we find a critical vulnerability, we address that well before it actually gets out into our users' hands to prevent any type of issue actually becoming a threat in the field. We did already cover some of the design principles and why this patch management becomes easy, but as a user, you simply just have to go through to HyperCore and click a single button to apply a patch. Sometimes those patches are rolling updates. Sometimes those patches are called in-place updates. Either way, the VMs remain online the entire time. And in that update, we're going to take everything from critical BIOS and firmware. We're going to take everything from the scribe storage layer, the AIM orchestration layer, the hypervisor, and we're going to update all of that as an atomic unit to make sure that we're protecting against regression issues in the environment. We want to make sure that that functionality remains the same. The fundamental idea here is that by making and applying this update process and having it just as painless as possible, users are going to be more likely to apply it. If they're more likely to apply it, they're going to have the latest protections against the vulnerabilities that we're proactively looking for. Now, we're going to continue here to talk about SecureLink. This is something that we introduced last year at this show. Really cool functionality. Taylor Lake's actually going to be on the stage next, and he's going to go through a whole lot of really cool things around Fleet Manager, of which this SecureLink is one. SecureLink, you can kind of think of it as built-in secure remote access for your HyperCore clusters, right? So, in fact, well, I won't steal Taylor's thunder. There's a really good anecdote that a customer we were talking to last night said, and I'll let Taylor tell that story. Our customers love this, because it gives them that access into HyperCore to be able to do whatever administration they need to without having to set up a traditional VPN, without having to set a jump server to have to manage that. A lot of you are MSPs out here, and every client has their own unique way of being able to connect into their network to manage things on the network, and this just eliminates all of that. Really simple to use, but it only matters if you're willing to use it, and you'd only be willing to use it if it's secure. So let me talk through the security aspect of this. As I mentioned earlier, every connection we're making for that initial communication starts with a trusted source of HyperCore and goes up through the firewall to Fleet Manager. That happens to be port 443, HTTPS, so all encrypted, TLS 1.2, very secure session. What is presented in that session through this proxy that Fleet Manager is managing is just a user interface. There's no underlying controls or anything beyond that that's exposed to the end user. And we're respecting whatever authentication method you have in place at the local level. We want to ensure that the integrity of that authentication process is maintained. So if you've got single sign-on set up, that works. If it's local sign-on, that works as well. We'll respect that as part of this. And so just by having access to the UI doesn't mean you're actually granted access to anything within the UI on the HyperCore side. Once the session terminates, so you've finished administering on the HyperCore cluster, you shut the browser, we automatically will shut down the proxy and terminate that connection. By eliminating the need for those complex traditional VPNs or jump servers that you might otherwise have for remote desktop access into that environment. We're really closing the gap on a lot of vulnerabilities that could exist in the environment due to misconfiguration. Those can be complex, they can be costly, both in terms of the licensing as well as the management side of it if you're going to try to keep it up to date. We've removed all of that with SecureLink. And now the final pillar, secure by default. You know, SC Platform is really designed with a secure by default philosophy, embedding zero trust principles directly into the product. We're trying to ensure that it's not merely just an option to have security, but really a fundamental, inextricable component of the system. And those of you that met Scott Loftmiller, our Chief Product Officer, and his pink hair, if you haven't met him, you've seen him. Scott is very opinionated on any subject. And I can tell you that our product is also very opinionated. You can see that in just the lack of checkbox features that you might see in the product. We believe we know what users need to be able to be successful in their deployment. And we've applied that same logic on the security side. We believe we understand the best practices in securing an environment like this, and we want to expose just those things. We want to make sure that there's not, a lot of post-deployment work that has to be done to make it a secure environment. It starts with zero trust out of the gate. As an example, if any of you have ever asked for root access, the answer is no. We do not give out root access, right? Our opinion is if we can keep you secure, if we can remove that attack surface from ever being surfaced out there to exploit, we're going to eliminate the exposure risk of our customers and our partners. Now, I mentioned this yesterday as part of the keynote, and I'll reiterate it here. Scale Computing is deeply committed to maintaining and enhancing our security position in the market. There are two upcoming milestones we're really proud to announce later this year. One is going to be our SOC 2 Type 2 audit results. The other is ISO 27001. Both of those are really our commitment to you as partners and customers that our own internal controls are in place when it comes to privacy. These are really just part of a broader strategy, and you're going to see from us over the coming years related to security and this space. It is of utmost importance, and no more so than now with all of the attacks and things that we see out there in the market. I want to thank everybody for joining me. If you have other questions, please do come talk to us, either at the show or in the community. I would also invite you to download our white paper on information security, which covers a lot of what it was that I covered here verbally, but in a little more detail. Thank you very much.